This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, this is the third of my interviews with presidential candidates who are not Democrats nor Republicans. Phil Collins is the man before you. He is the presidential nominee for the Prohibition Party in 2020, and the conversation will begin in a moment. Phil Collins is the presidential candidate in 2020 from the Prohibition Party. And as I usually like to do, I want to give my guests a few minutes to introduce themselves. So welcome, Phil. Before we get into politics and the Prohibition Party itself, can you give me a little background about who you are, where you come from, and what your general overall view of life is?
Okay, I live in Wisconsin, and I've lived in some other states, and because of the Navy, I lived in a territory and two foreign countries. I have a BA in political science, and I'm working on a master's in public administration. I was elected to one political office when I lived in the Chicago area. I ran for a township trustee in Libertyville Township in Lake County. The race is 6 candidates for 4 seats. I spent about $10 in my campaign, and I beat 2 incumbents. And it's a view of life, but I think that the government should, at all levels, for most of have lower tax rates and lower spending. And I hope the federal government will work more to spend money only on subjects that are authorized by the Constitution.
Well, before we get into the history of the Prohibition Party, why are you a prohibitionist rather than, say, a Republican or a Libertarian or a Constitutional Party? What specifically about the Prohibition Party attracts you?
The fact that they remind people about harmful effects of alcohol, like the fact that it causes heart problems and cirrhosis of the liver. I've never been drunk, so I thought it was a good party for me, and I agree with many parts of the party platform.
Well, given that this is 2020 and 1920, when you say prohibition, I would assume that you mean prohibition extends beyond alcohol. Would you also prohibit cigarette smoking as well as other drugs, such as marijuana and other harder drugs?
Yes. It's all their drugs, like marijuana and cocaine, except for medicinal purposes. Like if doctors think that a patient should have marijuana because of medical problems.
How about regular tobacco, regular cigarettes? How about regular cigarettes? Because I saw on the party platform that you say that alcohol and tobacco are the 2 biggest causes of disease.
Yes, tobacco also.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit then about the Prohibition Party. Obviously, when people think of the Prohibition Party, they think of the Prohibition era, which ended over 80 years ago. Over the decades since, the Prohibition Party has sporadically had candidates in various states and whatnot. But what is the purpose of the Prohibition Party now in the 21st century? I mean, is it simply just to prohibit alcohol and drugs and cigarettes, or is there a greater purpose to the party?
I think that that's the main purpose, to prohibit those things. Maybe not by the federal government, but mainly the local laws. Like the platform says, we believe in a sustaining program of educational legislation building from local to national is best way to strengthen community approval, disapproval of drug indulgence.
So you would prefer to have local governments prohibit alcohol and other drugs rather than the federal government?
Yes.
So with the history of prohibition, I mean, if we go back to the 1920s, just let's stay in the historical, and then we'll get to the current time. Prohibition did lead to the rise of organized crime, the mafia, and the prohibition of alcohol did, well, by some accounts, it did lessen the effects of alcoholism. It also increased crime rates through organized crime. Are you worried that if you tried to prohibit and could somehow be successful in prohibiting alcohol or other drugs, that crime rates would again soar, and you would be, giving a great source of income for illegal activity?
No, not worried about that. I never thought about it.
So let's talk then about some of the other bits of the party platform here. And I'll look here on the page. Prohibitionparty.org is the website, and let's talk about foreign trade, because it says that international trade has the potential to raise the standard of living for all nations. Are you in favor of some of President Trump's, sort of taxation wars with China and other countries, or are you for free and open trade?
I agree with most of what he did about trade. I agree with what the platform says about we favor free trade, but only on a reciprocal basis. And China has high tariffs on American products, so I think it should be fair and have similar tariffs on Chinese products.
How about
but if they lower their tariffs, then they should lower tariffs on Chinese products.
how about the Second Amendment rights? You are then for the Second Amendment?
Yes.
Does that include things such as
Yes.
all sorts? I mean, go ahead. Go ahead. Finish your thought.
We think Americans should have the right to own guns and defend themselves.
How about things like semi-automatic weapons, things that are generally used by criminals and are opposed by most police organizations? AK-47s, those kinds of things. I mean, it's one thing for a woman who lives in a dangerous area to carry a pistol in her purse if she fears to be raped, but if you're talking about carrying, militias that are carrying, cop killer bullets, guns with cop killer bullets, and things like that. I mean, most most of police organizations and police unions are against those kinds of weapons being in the hands of citizens. So do you support the use of semi-automatic weapons, or the rights of people to have semi-automatic weapons?
I haven't thought about that, but I think so.
So how about, because I see on, yeah. So I see you list also for immigration and border security. So are you then, are you also in support of President Trump's wall at the Mexican border? And what other things do you think that need to be done, things that maybe Trump has not done?
Yes, I'm in favor of all, and I think that the fines for hiring illegal aliens should be increased, because fewer employers would hire illegals, and more illegals would leave on their own without the government having to pay to arrest and deport them.
You also list marriage on your platform, that you support traditional marriage. Now, a few years back, the Supreme Court struck down oppositions to gay marriage. It seems from what I'm reading here that you are against gay marriage, but you support civil unions instead of gay marriage?
No, and
So are you for just traditional marriage between a man and a woman? Or,
no, that doesn't matter to me. And I read the platform too, and I don't see.
well, it says we acknowledge that religious values have played a positive role in the foundation of the USA. It says voluntary prayer. What marriage? Well, no, I'm sorry. We call for a constitutional amendment which shall read as follows: marriage is historically an institution and sacrament of the church. Only religious institutions shall decide what qualifies as a marriage for the purpose of two individuals who need only legal protection, such as for inheritance and for power of attorney, one for the other. This state may license civil unions. We oppose any efforts to compel members of the clergy to perform marriages of any sort. So, if it says here that marriage is historically an institution and the sacrament of the church, so you would then support gay marriage, though, but you only support the right of churches to perform weddings rather than, say, a judge.
Yes, and it could be maybe same sex according to that part of the platform. I know some Christian churches do same sex weddings.
So then the issue isn't gay marriage or straight marriage. The issue then is you think only churches should perform marriage. Civil courts should not.
Right, and civil courts do civil unions.
Okay, let's move on. My last interview was with the American Solidarity Party candidate. They are pro-life Christian Democrats. It also says that your platform is pro-life in respect to abortion, capital punishment, and euthanasia. you want to establish legislation or that a right to life from conception. So you're against the death penalty. So let's talk about those three aspects. The most obvious one is abortion. So I would assume, would you want to outlaw abortion at all phases, even in cases of rape or the health of the mother, the life of the mother too, as well?
No, no. If not if it endangers the health of the mother.
Okay.
But in all other cases, I think abortion would be illegal.
How about euthanasia then? About a decade ago in 2009, my mother was 86 years old at the time, and she got injured, and she didn't want to really live anymore. She was blind, she was suffering from emphysema and a few other things, and she basically starved herself for the last 17 days of her life to end her own life because she couldn't take, say, uh, a pill or get a shot to just euthanize her humanely. Why would you be opposed to someone, especially in the state that my mother was, or people in worse states, if they have a living will saying they don't want to live, if let's say they want to live their life in a coma the rest of their life? Why would you? What is the reason for opposing euthanasia then?
I don't, I don't know about that.
And the third part of the platform is the death penalty. So um, you are against the death penalty. So that would be in all cases. So I mean, if we're talking people who are, say, a serial killer or a terrorist, if we had caught the terrorist that bombed, well, say Timothy McVeigh, do you think that Timothy McVeigh should not have gotten the death penalty after killing dozens of people? And why? What is the rationale for opposing the death penalty in that case? So let me pick up a bit more on the platform and just sort of go down the list here, and then we'll talk a bit more generally about the Prohibition Party in 2020. Um, of many of the minor parties' platforms, I think yours might be the only one that I see with something specific to animal cruelty. Let me just read it. It says, "We oppose entertainments which inflict pain upon sentient beings, but not limited to cock and dog fighting and bear baiting. We oppose using animals for consumer product testing and weapons development, and would make compulsory disclosure of product labels, animal testing." So you are against the animal testing then, as well as things like cockfighting and dog fighting. Um, uh, how did that? What is your personal view? Are you against all animal testing and animal cruelty? And what would be the penalties then for people who would violate those laws? Would they be left up to the federal government or to local governments?
I'm against any testing that can uh, 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 hurt the animals, and I think the punishment should be left to each state government.
Uh-huh. So you also have you talk about the environment in the platform. So what is your take on global warming then, personally, or the party's take? Do you believe that global warming is man-made or not? And what measures would you take if you were president to mitigate global warming?
I don't know whether I have, because there's some scientists say there is global warming, and Other scientists say global cooling. However, some scientists who say we have global warming say that it's part of a cycle that's happened about every 300 years, that's 3,000 years at least. So it's hard to prove whether the warming was caused by people.
But
If
go ahead. Continue.
I was president, it's proof that there was global warming and it was caused by people. And then I'd ask some scientists for suggestions on what should be done about it.
How about healthcare? You list healthcare, and the platform says we prefer state-level healthcare to federal programs. So you are against things like Medicare for all, or even Obamacare?
Yes, because both of those disobey the 10th Amendment. The Constitution doesn't mention health care, so the federal government should do those things.
Well, I mean, the Constitution was written 244 years ago or so. I mean, there's lots of things it wouldn't mention. But so how would you, especially now with the COVID-19 health crisis, well, I just read 100,000 Americans at minimum have already died from it. It's far worse than any seasonal flu. And because of a lot of the state shutdowns, there's something like 35 to 40 million people who no longer have jobs that had jobs at the beginning of the year. And since most of their health care has been tied to jobs, these people have lost their health care in the middle of the worst health crisis this country has had in over 100 years. So what role should the federal government play? I mean, surely if the party is pro-life, you want to do something so that people should not be dying. So, I mean, what would the plan be if you were president in addressing the coronavirus deaths, if in terms of healthcare?
I think the federal government should encourage state governments to help their people with health problems, and if they need help, federal government should just give them loans that they would repay the federal government with very low interest rates.
Well, I mean, so were you in favor of the stimulus plan that Congress and President Trump recently put out, and now that there's talk of a second stimulus plan? What was your take on the first stimulus plan that President Trump and the Congress approved?
I know I didn't like either of them because that they were constitutional.
Well, but I mean, if you're going to, if you are pro-life and you, I mean, the federal government is where the money is printed. So I mean, to say that a state, if you have a poor state like Mississippi and they have people dying from COVID-19, they're going to need help from the federal government. So I mean, if you think it's constitutionally inappropriate for the federal government to intervene, how else is a state like Mississippi that's, I think, 49th or 50th in terms of poverty, how else are they going to combat something when they don't have the resources to do it? Only the federal government has the resources, not an individual small state like Mississippi.
And low interest loans and a loan from federal employees that there. Yeah.
Okay.
Private VA hospitals and made doctors there can help them.
Okay. So let me turn to some things beyond the party platform then. So the Prohibition Party is one of a dozen or so third parties. In order to get on enough ballots, in order to secure enough votes to get, for example, some federal assistance, you need to get to 5% of the national vote. The Green Party has come close a few times, so has the Libertarian Party. What is the overall plan for the Prohibition Party? Do you want to? How do you plan to get to, or hope to get to 5% of the votes so that you can qualify for federal matching funds? Or would the party, even if they got to 6%, say, would they not want the federal matching funds since that's not listed in the Constitution as well?
I'm never concerned trying to get to matching funds because that's not mentioned in the Constitution. I think that the Congress never should get those matching funds.
Okay. Well,
we're just trying to get on as many states as possible, and so I can spread the message or platform and try and get more votes than the party got 4 years ago. If I be on the ballot in Arkansas, I know I'll be on the ballot in Arkansas, and Mississippi, and I'll probably be on the ballot in Tennessee, and maybe California. I wonder the primary in California for the American Independent Party.
Okay. So
93 counties in California have won about 80 of them.
Mm-hmm. Well, since the Prohibition Party, and you've mentioned a few times the Constitution, one of the major principles of the U.S. Constitution is one man, one vote. And yet, if you look at the U.S. Senate, you can have a state like Wyoming or Alaska that has under 1 million people, and they have 2 senators, whereas states like Texas and California that have 30 and 40 million people also have 2 senators. So Texas and California are not getting the representation that they do as they do in the House of Representatives. So would you be, is the Prohibition Party, would you advocate for the abolition of the Senate since that violates the one man, one vote idea?
No, I think most of the agrees with it. They compromise. That let the Senate and House be the important in passing the law.
How about the Electoral College?
More representation to
Okay.
please.
All right. How about the Electoral College? 2 of the last 5 elections, the person who had the more popular votes has lost. And in the history of the country, I think it's been 5 or 6 times that the person who won the presidency had less popular votes. That's also an issue that people have had issue with since the beginning of the country. What is your opinion about the Electoral College?
And it's okay with me because that gives them a more representation to less populated states.
Mm-hmm. A number of states have instituted what they call ranked choice voting. Yeah, a number of states have introduced what's called ranked choice voting. So that say if there were 10 candidates running, you could rank the candidates in order of preference. Your top preferred candidate would be number one, your least preferred would be number two. And then if, let's say, no candidate got above a threshold of, say, 30 or 35%, whatever the state mandates, they would drop candidates, the bottom three or the bottom five candidates, and then those votes for those other candidates would then be naturally sorted out. And some people argue that this would allow third parties a greater chance to elect people to local offices. Do you support ranked choice voting rather than what we have now called first past the post voting, where the winner of an election wins the whole thing, or the winner of a primary in an election?
Yes, I think ranked choice voting is a great idea because now some people who consider voting for a third party candidate don't do it because they think it would split and help the candidate they hate. With ranked choice voting, then they're less likely to worry about that.
Okay. So let's talk a bit more about some ideas that have been tossed around here in the current 2020 campaign. Since President Trump basically ran unopposed, I think there were maybe one or two Republicans that ran against him briefly. He really didn't even have to run for re-election in the Republican Party for the nomination, rather. But some of the Democrats who are running came up with some ideas that have been around for decades, but only now were presented. The most obvious one was a candidate named Andrew Yang, who is a businessman, and he has an idea where he supports universal basic income, UBI, wherein people might get anywhere from $1,000 to $2,000 a month. And the reason for him supporting this, his main reason, was what he deemed the coming threat of automation in industries, meaning that robots would be doing a lot of the work in 10 or 20 years, and then people would be out of work. Just an apology to the people who'd be watching this. We had a little, we lost a connection there. But let me just restate before we were interrupted. I was talking about a businessman named Andrew Yang who came up or popularized the idea of UBI, or universal basic income, wherein the federal government would pay people, every citizen over the age of 18, like $1,000 a month. And his rationale for that was that in the next decade or two, he believes that automation of jobs from robots will result in millions of job losses. What is the Prohibition Party and your personal take on universal basic income? Are you for it or against it, and why?
I don't know what my party thinks about it, but I'm against it because I don't think anything like that is mentioned in the Constitution. I think it'd be easier to just cut tax rates for everyone who pays a federal income tax. Easier than sending tax money to Washington and then having Washington send money back to people every month.
So I was just looking on again on your platform. So let me talk about the military, because one of the terms that's also come up in the 2020 election is endless wars. And on your platform, there's discussion about what's called the just war. The just war principles. So since the Prohibition Party and you seem to be concerned with the Constitution, you then know that the American president has no right to declare war. That's the right of Congress. So in the last 50 or so years, we've seen a lot of presidents, both Democrats and Republicans, involve the U.S. in wars from Korea to Vietnam to Central America to now in the Middle East. Are you opposed to most of those wars, if not all of them, because they were not formally declared by the Congress?
Yes, well, not opposed to the actions. I get they shouldn't be called wars because they were declared as wars by Congress. So I agree with that.
But I mean, now we've been in Afghanistan for 18 years, and even though we've had some troop pull downs, I mean, uh, basically there's been no net effect. The Taliban is still in power, and if you were president, would you pull us out of Afghanistan since it's not a war? I mean, are you against just sending the U.S. military? I mean, because the platform sounds like you support the old Teddy Roosevelt principle that the U.S. should not be the cop, the cop to the world. What would you do, for example, with the troops that are still in Afghanistan? Would you pull them out of Afghanistan?
Yeah, maybe all of them, but I think it's okay to at least some people there as advisors in case the Afghan government wants some suggestions from American um, military leaders. I think the majority of them our troops should leave. I should have left leave 5 years ago.
Um,
I
so
was in the Navy for 21 years, and I was in Baghdad about 6 months. I didn't complain about it at the time. It was okay.
So in the Navy, were you deployed anywhere particular? Where did you serve?
Yeah, I was in Marine um, about 18 miles south of Baghdad from September 2004 to March 2005.
Uh-huh. So what were you? I mean, obviously you were going to do what your commander said, but if you had been president then, would you have gotten us involved in Iraq?
Yeah, maybe not have troops there as long as they were, but
Mhm.
at least send some people there and do what they did. Saddam Hussein out of power.
So let's talk about other foreign policy issues and countries. I had mentioned the COVID-19 stuff. I can pick up a little bit of that later. But what do you see, or what country do you see as the biggest existential threat to the U.S., putting aside this pandemic? Do you see it as China? Do you see it as North Korea? Do you see it as Iran or Russia? Going forward in the next 10, 20 years, do any of those countries, they each pose different threats? You've got Putin, you've got the Chinese communists, you've got uh, the wacky leader of North Korea, and then you have the Iranian uh, uh, fundamentalists. What which of those countries do you think poses the greatest threat to the U.S. and why?
Because they have a huge military, like nuclear weapons, and because some people think maybe they sent the virus all over the world on purpose. I don't know if that really happened, but I hope our federal government will investigate it more and find how the virus started and why it spread so much.
So I mentioned earlier talking about global warming. One of the things that a lot of people running for president have talked of here and there has been what's called the Green New Deal, which is trying to get reduce oil and coal, which are very carbon inefficient, and most scientists would claim are aiding global warming, to try to go over to things such as solar energy, wind energy, hydroelectric energy from dams and so forth. If you were president, what would you want to be cutting down on the usage of coal and oil, and getting into more what they call carbon neutral, energy sources such as I mentioned?
Yes. I don't think federal government should be involved in it much, but the president should encourage that a little. Like if an electric company wants to build windmills on federal land that's not used much right now, like in the West, there are big desert areas that don't have much use. And now I think federal government should allow that, because that would help have different sources of electricity and provide the federal government with more revenue, since they would charge the company to build the windmills there.
Let me just return to the COVID-19 crisis that's right now, because as we're recording, this is towards the end of May of 2020, and so it's been about 2.5, 3 months since most of the nation and most of the world has been dealing with it. So a lot of what seems to be on the platform of the Prohibition Party deals with federal versus state level powers. If a state says that they're going to keep their industries or keep stores closed because of maybe a second outbreak in their state, does the federal government have a right to go in and tell that state that they have to open their businesses or not? Could President Trump tell a governor he has to open up his state?
I think there's something that disobeyed a federal law, but in that case, I don't think that would apply.
So let me just before we wrap up here, I want to talk a little bit about what differentiates the Prohibition Party from some of the other parties. First off, let me just start off with President Trump. What are some of the things that you think that President Trump has done wrong in the last 4 years, and why you think that you would be a better choice to replace him?
I think he signed a few laws which gave money to Planned Parenthood, and since our party says we're pro-life, I would have done that if I were president. And Trump signed laws that spend money on education, and our platform says that because the 10th Amendment, education should be a subject only for state and local governments.
Mm.
I think that Trump should at least try to cut spending from the Department of Education and ensure that the federal government wouldn't give money to any school. And since the federal government would need less money, the same law also should cut tax rates. But then some state governments would change their tax rates to make sure that they spend enough money on education.
And how about the presumptive Democratic Party nominee, Joe Biden? Why do you think that you would make a better president than Joe Biden would?
He liked Obamacare, even though I think it disobeyed the 10th Amendment. So if he's president, he'd probably want to propose other bills that are unconstitutional.
Let me then talk about the two other major minor parties, the Libertarians and the Green parties. Obviously, you'd have far more differences with the Green Party, but a lot of what you support would be supported by the Libertarian Party of the U.S. as well. What differentiates the Prohibition Party from the Libertarian Party?
Well, I think they have nominated anybody for president yet, but their party, the platform, usually doesn't mention abortion. Some of their candidates are pro-life, but just the majority of them are pro-choice. A lot of their candidates don't mention abortion at all.
So, go ahead.
I'm pro-life. I remember the Prohibition Party is pro-life.
Well, I'm going to link to the party's website, which is prohibitionparty.org below. In closing, let me just ask you then, if you had to just take a couple of minutes here to speak to people who would be voting, if you want to take 2 or 3 minutes and say why they should vote for you over President Trump or Joe Biden or any of the other parties. So, Phil, let me just give you a last couple of minutes to make your case. As I said, well, why do you think that you would make a better choice for president than President Trump, Joe Biden, or any of the other minor party candidates?
I think because part of the Prohibition Party is the only one who reminds people about the harmful effects of alcohol and tobacco, and help people be healthier, and we also care about many other issues, and low tax rates, low federal spending, pro-life, and pro-gun rights, and one good, better border security. Appreciate people can share my campaign. We'll read the platform on website www.prohibitionparty.org.
Okay.
Thank you for the interview.
All right. Well, I will link to prohibitionparty.org below, and you can read there about the party platform and Phil Collins. So, Phil, thanks for your time, and good luck in the race.
Thank you.